Later 20th century history has left its mark on the Antarctic landscape. On both the South Shetland Islands and the Antarctic Peninsula, you can see evidence of human activity relating to exploration, science, and to attempts to assume sovereignty over the region. Exploration of the Antarctic Peninsula didn't end with Wilkins' pioneering flights. Exploring from the air was useful in terms of the terrain you could cover, but it still had limitations. For example, it was hard to tell, sometimes, whether you were flying over ice-covered land or ice-covered water. And even in the early 1930s, it was thought that the Antarctic Peninsula was a group of islands, separated from the Antarctic mainland by a number of channels. These channels were marked on the chart, and they even had names. The main one, the largest one, was called the Stephenson Strait. The expedition that eventually resolved this issue was land-based. The 1934 British Graham Land expedition, actually led by an Australian called John Rymel, set up 2 bases on the Antarctic Peninsula, the first of which was at the site of the current-day Werde House in the Argentine Islands, though the hut that we see there today is a later replacement. In the course of their exploration and scientific survey, they determined that the peninsula was in fact a peninsula and not a series of islands after all. In the decade after World War II, the amount of scientific work and exploration being undertaken on the Antarctic Peninsula increased dramatically. The bases established by Operation Tabarin during the war were transferred to a new civilian organisation, the Falkland Islands Dependency Survey, later renamed the British Antarctic Survey, who immediately began building more scientific stations. Other countries, such as Chile and Argentina, also created permanent scientific bases on the peninsula, with personnel stationed at them all the year round. This increase mirrored what was happening on the rest of the continent. More and more countries were becoming interested in Antarctica, until by the 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, there were 12 nations, working from almost 50 stations across the continent. The South Shetland Islands and Antarctic Peninsula housed a number of these stations. Some of them, like the Chilean Bernardo O'Higgins and Argentinian Esperanza bases, are still used today. Others, like the British Tatai Hut, are preserved as historic monuments, and others have been dismantled altogether and exist only in the form of a plaque. Some of what we see are the attempts to make life safer for this burgeoning human population. Refuge huts, beacons, navigational markers. Life could still be hazardous for those stationed at an Antarctic research base, however. This memorial cross on Peterman Island commemorates 3 men who were lost while trying to cross the sea ice, and the monument outside the Falkland Islands Museum in Stanley honours the 29 personnel of the British Antarctic Survey who have lost their lives since 1944. Wilkins' flight from Deception Island over the Antarctic Peninsula was also just the first of many. The first major aerial survey of the Antarctic Peninsula took place in the late 1950s, carried out by the Falkland Islands Dependency Survey, who were stationed at Whalers Bay on Deception Island. The aeroplane hangar that we visit here dates from this period. A few decades later, another runway was established on the peninsula. Between the 1970s and the early 1990s, the British Antarctic Survey used a 400-metre stretch along the spine of this glacier on Danko Island as a runway. This little hut was effectively the airport, where personnel would wait, sometimes for weeks or even months, for the weather to clear up so they could board a plane and fly to Rothera Station further to the south. All of this activity had an impact on political developments in Antarctica, and by the late 1950s there were 7 countries that laid claim to different territories, claims that were based on their historic involvement in an area. Sometimes, inevitably, these claims overlapped. The relatively accessible South Shetland Islands and the Peninsula region were claimed by three countries: the United Kingdom, Argentina, and Chile. This situation was of course resolved when the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, and each of these states agreed to set aside their claims for the duration of the treaty. Another provision of the Antarctic Treaty was that any signatory had the freedom to set up their own base in Antarctica in order to carry out scientific research on the continent. Today, about 30 different countries have at least one base in Antarctica. A particular popular choice of location is the relatively accessible King George Island, which houses 8 year-round stations and several more that are only run in the summertime. These political developments have left their mark on the landscape in other ways as well. Though the United Kingdom, Chile and Argentina have agreed to suspend their claims to Antarctica, they have not agreed to give them up altogether. Visitors to the Antarctic Peninsula and the South Shetland Islands will see a number of buildings that we might call placeholders, clear reminders of a country's historical involvement and continued commitment to their Antarctic territory.